Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. We are missing my beloved bride again today when it is time for me to do another Curating Your Movie Library segment. And so, as has been my habit often in the past, not always, but often, I have come up with a top 5 list. This list may not resonate with you because it's a little bit personal to me, because the qualifying standard of my list is this. I'm giving you a list of the top 5 television programs that were before my time. The top 5 television programs that were before my time. Now, through the magic of reruns, of course, I was able to see all of these shows, which is why I know how to do this. Although, actually, one of these shows I've never actually seen, though I have seen segments of it. So let's get to this list. This is the top 5 television programs that were from before my time. I, by the way, was born in 1965. Some of these, at least one of these, was still airing new episodes after I was born, but not after I was old enough to actually watch television. So our top 5 shows from before 1965, that started before 1965. Let's start with number 5, The Ed Sullivan Show, which is not one that I have seen. I have seen the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show. I've seen the Doors on The Ed Sullivan Show. I've heard of Coco Gigio and Senor Wenceslas, but I've never actually watched from beginning to end any episode of The Ed Sullivan Show. But I have to admit, come on now, I have to admit this was significant television. That this was a level of star making and star drawing that probably has never been seen since. And I also have to confess that I find Ed Sullivan himself to be oddly not very good as a host, which makes it, in a strange way, rather entertaining. So we'll start with Ed Sullivan, number 5. Number 4, Leave It to Beaver. Leave It to Beaver made it on the list here. This was one of those shows that I did get to watch in reruns quite a bit as a kid and really enjoyed it. Part of the reason I enjoyed it, and this is often the case even in our day, I really like a show with excellent secondary characters. I love Eddie Haskell, of course, who's virtually not a secondary character. But I also liked Whitey and Lumpy and whatever the girl's name was, Judy, I think her name was. Lots of great secondary characters in that show. And especially when he was younger, just an outstanding job by Jerry Mathers. So Leave It to Beaver makes it on my list at number 4. At number 3, The Honeymooners. I don't think I'd even heard of The Honeymooners until I was in college. But I remember where I was the first time I saw The Honeymooners. I was in my grandmother's house. My grandmother lived in Pittsburgh while I was in college, and on this particular night she was not there, and I was staying in her house. It was about an hour from my school. And she had access to channels that I didn't have. She didn't have cable, but she had, her aerial brought in shows that I didn't have access to. And that's late at night, they were showing The Honeymooners, and I really enjoyed it. I was really struck at the simplicity of the show. This one single, setting and just these 4 characters in the conversation. Very, very impressive. And of course, Jackie Gleason's wonderful, and Art Carney as well. That's number 3 on my list. Number 2, The Twilight Zone. Man alive, it was the same. My stars, that's amazing. It was the same time, the same night that I saw my first Twilight Zone. It wasn't the best Twilight Zone I ever saw, but of course that's just right up my alley. I love that kind of exploration of what if scenario style anthologies. Lisa and I have watched our way through all of the Twilight Zone relatively recently, trying to find something like it on one of the streaming services that we have. I'd love to see Outer Limits or what's the other one? Tales from the Dark Side. I would love to just get more of this good stuff. That's number 2, The Twilight Zone. And by the way, one of the things about that, because it is an anthology, there's so many actors in it that, end up in bigger places later on. That's a lot of fun to see actors from other shows or other movies showing up in that. Of course, number 1, I don't need to tell you. You should know by now, if you've been listening faithfully. The greatest show, but from before my time, is actually the greatest show that ever was. And that is the Andy Griffith Show. I don't know that I could describe its glory without unintentionally insulting it by fall so far short of how glorious it is. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that there's a great dip, a significant dip when Barney left the show and when they became color shows. But even those are pretty doggone good. So that's my top 5 list. And as always, when we do a curating your movie library segment, I would love to hear from you. What do you think about my list? I could give an honorable mention to I Love Lucy, which is pretty doggone funny. I don't know what else. Maybe Bonanza, though I wasn't a huge fan of that. Let me know what you think, what I missed, and what I hit on with this list of the top 5 shows from before 1965. We come now in our ongoing series on the parables to the parable of the wedding feast that we find in Matthew chapter 22. And it is a rich one. I really delight in this one. I think at that spot, that sweet spot where the pieces fall into place, not too easily, not like you're doing a toddler's puzzle, but also not too difficult, not like you're doing a 1,000-piece puzzle. It particularly helps us to see what's going on here if we understand a few basic principles from Jewish wedding tradition in the time. When a man and a woman became betrothed, it was common for the parents of each to sort of draw up the agreement, the betrothal agreement, and when it is signed, the couple is deemed to be married. However, they do not come together at this point. This is why there's not exactly the same thing as how we look at engagement in our day. So instead, the couple would go their separate ways, the daughter back to her parents, and the son would go to prepare the home for his new bride. And that preparation, we don't know how long that might take. It could take any amount of time. And once it was finished, the bridegroom would come for the bride, and the two of them would consummate the marriage, and then there would be this great wedding feast. But one didn't know. There were no save the dates. One didn't know when this was going to get done. And so invitations would go out, and the expectation would be that those who would come when the final invitation came. Well, in this context, the servants are sent out with the message that the marriage feast is ready, and two things happen. One, the people who are invited don't come, and two, they hurt and even kill the messengers who came with that message. Well, let's just stop right there and make sure we understand very clearly who the players are in this. The king, who's the father of the groom, he represents God. And this feast, as Jesus says, represents the kingdom. And the people who were invited, but who didn't come, who didn't listen to the invitation givers, and in fact killed them, these were the Pharisees, those Jews who heard from John the Baptist, who heard all the prophecies in the Old Testament, and yet did not come into the kingdom. So they, under the king's orders, are put to death. And this invitation now goes out to those who are not naturally the invitees to this great feast. That would be the Gentiles. The Gentiles are brought in. They weren't originally invited, but they are brought in, and they come to this great celebration. Well, then there's this sort of little addendum that I just think is wonderful. The bad guys have been vanquished. The wedding party's going on. The good guys are now there. But lest we think that the good guys are there because they're good guys, we have this subplot at the end of the story where the king notices that there's someone at the wedding who's not wearing wedding clothes. Now, another tradition would be that oftentimes wedding clothes would be provided by the groom's father for the guests to wear. And to refuse to wear them and to come in your own clothes was a great affront to the host of the celebration. Well, this shouldn't be too hard to figure out once we get that, right? This fellow who's come into the party has come in dressed in his own righteousness. He thinks he's worthy to be there. He thinks that what he brings to the table is what makes him worthy. He's a part of the kingdom in one sense. He's there. He's enjoying the celebration. But in another sense, he doesn't belong. And he's sent out into the outer darkness. This represents those who are a part of the visible church, who partake in the blessings of the visible church, some of them, but who are not and never have been covered in the righteousness of Christ, who lack that faith by which that righteousness becomes theirs. And so, of course, they don't belong. Of course they're sent out. This is not the king being a jerk. This is the king dealing with a pretender to the faith. Now this parable, it seems as though Jesus is getting a little more direct, a little farther away from plausible deniability. You can almost sense a fire in his eyes as he's telling these stories, and he's thinking about these Pharisees and how they're going to be destroyed. By the way, some have argued, I would be among them, that the destruction that the king sends against those who would not come to the celebration is precisely what happened when the Roman Empire came down on the Jews in 70 AD and destroyed all of Jerusalem. That's my thinking on the matter anyway. So, just a wonderful, in-depth, precise, and compelling picture here that Jesus gives us. And our calling, I would argue, is to cling to the righteousness of Christ that's not ours by nature, but that's been given to us, and that we would rejoice and give thanks for being, by his grace, a part of the kingdom. We come now in our ongoing series on the Westminster Shorter Catechism to question 71, still in the exposition of the Ten Commandments, and for a second time now, specifically dealing with the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, question 71 asks this question: what is required in the seventh commandment? and our fathers in the faith answered this way. The seventh commandment requires the preservation of our own and our neighbor's chastity in heart, speech, and behavior. The seventh commandment requires the preservation of our own and our neighbor's chastity in heart, speech, and behavior. Once again, I have to praise these gentlemen for being so succinct. And by that, I don't merely mean brief, but rather that in a very few words, they're able to pack in a great deal of information. Let's start with these two responsibilities, or the two directions of these responsibilities. That is, they argue that the seventh commandment requires us to not only be on guard and labor to preserve and to protect our own chastity, but also our neighbors. We're supposed to do both of these things. Now, one of the things that we're witnessing in our day that I think is part and parcel of so much of the sexual confusion in the broader culture is a constant bout of finger pointing. That it's always the other person's fault when propriety is not kept. So we have men who have maybe a struggle with their hearts, as we see described at the end of this answer, people who are lusting in their hearts, who want to blame their lust on the appearance or the clothing or the lack thereof of ladies. Then we have women who want to excuse their behavior by blaming men, taking the view that an adult woman is somehow left powerless and unable to resist the charms of any man that's in a position of greater power or prestige than or authority than she is, and she's just only a victim. Well, as God's law does so often, the truth of the matter is both. That my responsibility for my neighbor's chastity means I don't go around trying to seduce women. And my neighbor's responsibility for my chastity may mean that you don't dress in a provocative way. You don't present a provocative appearance. It's both. And one person's failure doesn't undo the other person's responsibility. If someone isn't dressed modestly, I'm not excused if that leads me into sin. Isn't even the right way of putting it. If I have sin regarding that, my sin is my sin. Their sin is their sin. But we do have a responsibility to be our brothers and sisters' keepers. So it's both of these things. Next, there's a list of the different ways this can come to be. These three different things. It's in heart, speech, and behavior. Well, that language of heart, this just gets right back to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, again saying, look, you haven't kept this commandment if you have managed to keep your clothes on with someone who's not your spouse. You can have a form of adultery in the dark recesses of your own heart. You can have a form of adultery in your speech. Wow. This is serious. I'm going to tell you a story. I knew a young guy, a professing Christian, strong Christian as far as I could tell. He was youngish, not married, and committed to a biblical sexual ethic. And he had the sense and the discipline to not watch things on television that he shouldn't be watching that were sexually provocative. But he liked watching shows that were funny about sexual things. The kind of sitcom conversation that appears on prime time, but deals with prurient things. And I said to him, I said, look, I want you to be careful here. The devil not only is interested in leading you away from sexual purity, and I know you've got your guard up against that, and that's good, and you should. I said, but you might also be on guard against a cynical view of this beautiful gift. If it's the occasion for humor for you, it's going to twist and distort where your head's at with respect to the marital act. This is a precious gift from God. And we need to not be snarky and silly about it, but treat it as a precious gift from God for husbands and for wives. Next time, we'll come to question 72, which I trust will tell us what's forbidden in the seventh commandment. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.